We're going to sit here for just a moment so I can give you all just a little bit of info. One, I'm a teacher. So I always do things that are completely unplanned based on the group because that's called agility. And that's what teachers do. We switch it up. So I thought I was going to start one way, but I think I'm going to start kind of another way for us today, besides the breath. So that breath was your first chance to participate. You will probably likely have two chances today to be in community with another person. So I just want you to be prepared for that. Because I know for some people, it takes a bit to prepare yourself to be ready to be in community. And as part of that preparation, I wanted to make sure that we had some agreements for today. So our first agreement that I would like us to focus on, Elaine, if you can hit that button, these are going to fade in. Our first agreement is confidentiality. Anything that you hear when you are in your pair share or that somebody shares about an organization that they work with, please hold that as confidential. You can share the bigger idea. For example, if someone says something about belonging, you can share their big idea about belonging, but don't show their name and organization. Let's go to the second one. The second one, candor. Let people know what you need and want, especially when you're in your pairing conversations. Also, let me know what you need and want as we're working together. Candor is something that we need to practice. In most of the cultures that we work in, candor is not always the most welcome thing, depending on who you might work for, right? Or who you work with. So be clear about your needs and wants. The third one, please, Elaine. Community. Communities of care. Think about intent and impact, right? So my intention can be very good, but the way I say something may impact you. Let folks know if their intent and impact are not necessarily matching for you. Can we all agree to these? If you can, just give me a wave if you're visible. If you can, if you're not visible, if you can type into the chat box, yes, I agree. That would be great. Fantastic. So Elaine, if you can move to the next one. So my life, for the most part, has been spent in schools. I've had, as I put it, a little time out of schools to work in other industries, in hospitals, in large Fortune 500 companies and human resources. And then I came right back to school and have been in school, as Lori said, for the last 20 years. So they have taught me so very much. So the first thinking that I'd like to do with you all is about what I've learned in schools and how we're socialized when we're very small people. So I'd love it if you all could think with me as I go through this. So I'm going to start with talking about race. So I just want to say, check yourself physically when I said the word race. What was your response to that? Right? So just be in that response, be aware of it. And then I want to ask you this question. Raise your hand if you have a memory, an early memory about race, or put it in the chat with, yes, I have a memory, an early memory of race. It could be an incident, it could be a conversation. Yeah, most of us do. All right, in the chat, put how old you were. How old were you when that conversation happened, or that incident, or that experience? Okay. I'm seeing a range of ages. And for most of us, the research shows that between the age of 3 and 7, we have our first racialized experience. All right, in the chat, think about this one. Think about that early memory that you have and how old you were. What emotion did you associate with that experience? And type that emotion into the chat. Confusion, that oftentimes comes up. Frustration, shock, disconnect, anger at a parent. Yeah. So all of those are pretty common. Anger, shock, fear, embarrassment. Some people have positive associations, learning, as Shay said. That was one of the emotions that she associated with it. So I'm going to ask this question, and I want you to think about it. After you had that experience, did you talk with a caring adult in your life? Some people are saying yes. Some people are saying no. For the most part, when we ask this question in large groups of people, usually that answer is no. And the reason behind that is because we learn at a very young age not to talk about race, right? And I'm going to launch into a story to help us as we delve into this idea of belonging. So if you could go to the next slide, Elaine, and thank you all for being participatory in that activity. So this is 5-year-old Dory. I was small, precocious, and starting kindergarten. And my mother decided that I needed to not go to my neighborhood kindergarten, but that I needed to go into the quote unquote better school. The better school was in a mostly white neighborhood. And on my first day of kindergarten, I remember walking into the classroom and looking around and realizing that I was the only Black child. 2 months into it, we have Halloween, and I cannot remember the antecedent, what happened that triggered this. And oftentimes it's interesting. I have what I call the response that most people of color have is I oftentimes wonder, even now as a 56-year-old, about this incident that happened when I was 5, where I think, what is it that I did as an antecedent to have this kind of reaction? Have no idea what we were arguing about. We could have been arguing over blocks, over candy, who knows? And this child who I thought was a friend turned to me and said these words. So I didn't go back to kindergarten for 8 months. And I never told my parents the story. Not to this day have I ever talked about this incident with my parents. It was, I was a much older adult when I started thinking about like, oh, that was the first time where I really felt ashamed and like I didn't belong. And this is an opposite event. I didn't have pictures from this era, so I chose a picture of the Alvarado Day Camp area. So this is the exact opposite experience. When I was 7, I was a Girl Scout, and I was a terrible Girl Scout. I knew not how to tie a rope, not how to do any of the things that Girl Scouts and Brownies do. I was pretty terrible at it. But I did decide I wanted to go to Girl Scout camp. And one of the experiences at Girl Scout camp is an overnight experience. Well, everybody in my troop opted not to participate in that experience. So I was once again the only from my troop, and a 16-year-old counselor brings me over to another group and says, join them, and drops me off without introducing me or anything else. And there was this one amazing child. I still remember her name, Jenny. Jenny steps out of the crowd and takes my hand and brings me over and says, my name is Jenny, and then goes around and begins introducing me to everybody from her troop, right? So this incredibly emotionally intelligent 7-year-old brought me in and introduced me. And that has always been a memory of mine. So when we start to talk about belonging, it's important to think about what are our own experiences. We're centering ourselves in our own self-awareness. So this is the moment where you all are going to get to talk about that. So what I'd love to do is just take maybe 3 minutes for people to write down and jot a little bit. Doesn't have to be complete sentences, or draw a picture of a moment where you felt like you absolutely belonged. And we're going to look at the polarity, and a moment where you felt like you didn't belong. So those two. So I'll call out time in about 3 minutes. And you're going to share this with a partner. Something that came up for them that was an aha, please do. Please add that to the chat. And if you did not get the alert that you're coming back, please do think your partner. I saw somebody thinking their partners. And you can also unmute. What came up? What patterns did you see? What commonalities? What differences? In group, out group? Absolutely. Yes, inclusion needs to be intentional. Belonging needs to be intentional. And sometimes you found your people at a later age. Yeah, so many of those comments of being unsafe or not belonging speak to this idea of psychological safety, right? We know that people are so much more productive when they can be in a psychologically safe space. And it is true for all of us, right? So with this, thank you all for participating and sharing with each other. That is really foundational. And I think that is the foundation of this work in groups, right? And some people will say, you're a teacher. Teachers have these moments where they get to be woo-woo and they get to do this sharing business. I don't think this is uncommon in business. And I will say that it's about making space for it, right? And the business case. And oftentimes what I say is the business case for this is, do you want to have a well-running business where people are staying, so you have retention and people are being engaged? So this is a picture of me at my all-girls Catholic high school, right? You would think a place where there was automatically belonging, and I will say there was automatic belonging. There are 63 people in my high school class, right? So there's this automatic sense of we're all women, we're all here together, but we were all very different. And the teacher who's pictured here is Judy Conflat. Judy was the first person to say to me, hey, you know what? You don't have to be best friends with everybody, but you do have to be able to work with them, right? And she did some very intentional things around bringing this group of 4 leaders for a school together and having us align in certain ways. So one of the things that she did, she would take us on a trip together. And she said, traveling will tell you a lot about the other people that you're traveling with. And it'll also give you an opportunity to set up norms. And so we set up agreements for how we would travel. And we worked together during that trip on planning what a year would look like for a group of 400 other students. I still to this day am not best friends with everybody in this group. Two of these folks are really good friends of mine, so we had a social connection, but that's part of this piece of belonging too, knowing what level and what type of connections you have with people and being okay with that, right? One of these people who will remain nameless, she used to call herself a real crowd pleaser because she was always wanting to be everybody's best friend. And she realized that that just wasn't going to happen, that sometimes she would encounter people who didn't want to be her best friend, but they were people that she would work with. So I think that's one of the things that we as individuals can work on is figuring out, and we'll talk about this a little bit more when we get to the case study, who are our people, who are going to be our social confidants at work, who are going to be the people that we work with and do good work with, and what do we need to know to work alongside people. Elaine, if you could go to the next slide. And this is precisely what I learned in college. So this is Tansel Pope. He is a math specialist who also is a philosopher, as I put it, because when I got to UC Berkeley, where there's 5,000 people in a class, and I was feeling lost and afloat after having been with 63 women who I all knew pretty well, the first thing he said to me is, you have to find your people. So you figure out, he goes, you're not going to meet all 5,000 people. You're going to meet 600 people in some of these classes. Who are your people that are going to be supportive and positive forces in your life? And that has been a philosophy that I have used as an educator. So Elaine, if you go to the next one. So this is what the research says, and I'll let you all look at it. Carissa Romero is an amazing researcher from Stanford University who has done a lot of work on belonging in schools. So if you take a look at that and read it, just type in the chat some words or phrases that stand out to you. And also there's a second one from our friends at Better Up, and you may know Better Up because they just hired Meghan Markle's husband to be their chief innovation officer. So what stands out? Seeing a person as a person of value, being confident, being trusting. So we can see the overlap. There's such an overlap between what we expect in the realm of students, and I mean our very youngest, our 3-year-olds, and what we expect in the realm of adults. Trust, connected, supported, all of these play into our sense of belonging. So I want to take these ideas and have us think together about a case study. So if you go to the next slide, Elaine, that would be great. Thank you. So here's our case study. The next one. So here's the story. I'm teaching at a school for the first time. I've been teaching for about 10 years. I have 12 students. And one morning in October, and October is what I call the end of the honeymoon period in teaching. September is all love and grace because we've just gotten to know each other and we're investigating what those relationships are. Come October, we know who's in the room. And one morning, a student walks in early, walks up to me and says this line, "This class sucks and I hate being here." So I would love to say that my reaction was, "Oh, honey, what can we do?" That was not my reaction. My reaction was ego-filled. My reaction was that of a 10-year veteran teacher who said, "No child's going to talk to me that way." Right? And I did. I said it. I had my assistant in the room. I said, "Could you take him for a walk for a little bit while I'm thinking?" And she did. She read the room really well. She read my emotional state really well. And I say all this to say that oftentimes when we get feedback, there are elements of how we're socialized, what we think about authority that come up. And all of that came up in this moment. And so I needed time to reflect. And I'm going to say, oftentimes, this is not what happens in predominantly white institutions. We are moving from task to task, and we are honed and trained to look at our successes, right? So we look at it and we go, oh, that was successful, that was great, but we don't analyze it. So what my assistant did was the greatest gift of all. She took this child with her, took him for a walk, and gave me time to think. And this is where my thinking went. Eventually, I was able to put aside the ego, and I was able to think, I need to find out what's going on here. And now I know what that's called. In design thinking, how many people use design thinking in their work? Any elements of it? So design thinking is really big in schools right now. I'm going to say sometimes things are trends. I don't see design thinking as a trend. I see it as a framework. So in that framework of design thinking, I decided to start doing empathy interviews. And I did it not only with this child, but with all the students, right? And this was the first time I had done that. I usually talk to students during the year, but this was the first time where this was such a sighting, such a moment that I thought, if it sucks for this child, and pardon my using the word sucks, but I'm quoting the author, if it sucks for this child, who else does it suck for? Right? And then I started to reflect about how I was feeling about the class and how my assistant felt about the class, right? Because my assistant to this day is a great colleague. And I oftentimes have trouble using that word assistant because for me, she was a co-teacher because we were in this together. So this is what we did. If you go to the next slide, we did an empathy interview. And these are my friend's answers, right? And I gotta say, I love WAJ's answers. Think about a place that doesn't suck. What does that place look like? The first one, I just told him, yeah, no, non-negotiable. You don't get to do whatever you want, whenever you want. It's just not gonna happen. But then there were some things that were really crystallized. People listen to me. I know everyone there. And I'm the best at something, right? So this really gets to looking at it as adults. Have we asked these questions, right? Oftentimes I say things are left to people in authority, right? The hierarchy rules. So you expect your manager to create your environment and your culture, your team culture. What if we could create our team culture, right? And that's what we ended up doing with the children. So after we did all of these interviews, we put that together to create something, but we had one more step that we wanted to do. And Elaine, if you go to the next one. So this is something that if you've taken high school English and happened to read Romeo and Juliet, they probably forced you to do this, right? I always think of that moment in high school when you're reading Romeo and Juliet and your teacher says, because there are so many characters going on in this play, you have to draw a sociogram so you know who's related to who. So taking that concept of the sociogram, we used it for this particular group of kids. And when you look on the left, you can see where WAJ was at the beginning, right? And the green arrows show one-way connections, right? Like a child wanting to connect with somebody else. The blue double arrows show a mutual connection, a weaving together. And I used to say, I wondered at why I was having a hard time with this group at the beginning. So what are you seeing in those connections, folks? Go ahead and put it into the chat. What do you see? A lot of loneliness, a lot of one-wayness. Kids making their best attempt to connect and perhaps being rejected. And there are so many stories I could tell about this particular group of kids. Yeah. There's no connection, right? And so Carissa's wonderful research really says that connection is so vital, right? And this is why my co-teacher, the children, and I were all struggling. We were going home exhausted every day. So then we started to do some things, right? And so some of the actions we took definitely did not work. I remember one that definitely did not work was we were going to pair people in line with people that they didn't necessarily have any connection to. It was an absolute disaster, right? So that is a great metaphor for taking two people in your workplace that you know maybe don't have a relationship and saying, hey, work on this project together without any guidance. And the disaster in that form of pairing the kids together in line ended up looking like us taking 40 minutes to go 40 feet because we had to keep stopping, regrouping, right? The best thing that we did that worked the best for us was setting up intentional interaction moments for the kids that had a framework around it, right? And so an example would be saying, today you're going to play and you're assigned to play with fairies and houses, right? And so the kids knew what space they were supposed to be playing in. And then we gave them a task. Can you write a story about fairies and houses? So later, when I became a director of inclusion and community engagement, this played out as well when you have affinity spaces with older folks, right? It's not enough sometimes to just take people who have shared identity and put them together. It sometimes takes having something to talk about. So sometimes that might be an artifact. It might be a process within your environment that they need to talk about. But over time, you get to a drawing that looks like sociogram 2. Oh, thanks, Elaine. So sociogram 2, if you can go back one more. Sociogram 2 was really what it looked like after we had done a lot of work with the children of putting them together.
I'm so sorry, Dory.
It's all good. It's all good. That sociogram doesn't want to sit up there, right? So what do you notice about the second one? And you can unmute and just shout out, what do you see?
I think people have got interested in each other.
Yeah, they start to build trust. They're starting to have more connection.
There's mutual respect within the whole classroom. It's been established because they're all working well together.
Yes. So you have kids who are working together, and you'll notice that there's still a green arrow, right? And WAJ, who gave me the your class sucks comment, was still having a one-way relationship, a one-way interaction with one child, right? And that I can say stayed all the way. These kids are in high school now. They still have that kind of relationship, right? They set each other off. They are not a good combination even at 15 years old. But we started to figure out who worked well together. So Elaine, now we can go to the next one. Let's do it. So I wonder about this activity. For you all to draw your own sociogram, make up your own symbols for the relationships, and think about what patterns you see in your world, right? In your world of work, what does your sociogram look like? So I'm going to say, give it a quick start. Elaine, and you let me know when we need to end for Q&A.
I think we have plenty of time, Dory.
Okay. In that case, folks, do you like music? Because music for me is a motivator. So I'm going to put on a little music on my computer for us.
And Dory, I just want to add some context that, like, if we work in a larger organization, we probably are a part of multiple sociograms, right? So we might, if we're a leader, we might have the sociogram of our direct reports, or maybe if we report to somebody, we have the sociogram of our boss and our colleagues. And so we might have to sort of pick one to focus on.
Exactly. Thank you, Lori, for that. I oftentimes will focus on my team. Right. So I do this whenever I'm working with a group, and I go into schools quite frequently to support. So if I'm working with a group of leaders, I might do the sociogram around their leadership. And it usually involves that big piece of that empathy interview, right? Because a lot, as I put it, quantitative data by itself is not enough. You need to match qualitative and quantitative together to really get an idea about relationships. And so that's why the importance of talking to people, because sometimes in those conversations, you'll hear like, oh, so-and-so doesn't like me. And it won't come up. I'll just say, what's your favorite thing? What do you like about working here? And they'll talk about everything. And then all of a sudden, in the last 2 minutes, there'll be that comment, I don't think so-and-so really likes me, but I enjoy working with them. And I don't know what that is. So absolutely focus on which one you want to draw. For now, is it your team? Is it a larger group? And I'm going to give us some music to work by. So folks, take a minute to wrap up your sociogram. That's the last element that we'll have time to add today. And I'm going to say, hold on to it and come back to it. For some big teams, this might be exceptionally difficult to draw, right? If you have a job where you are having a lot of contact with different people. So what I suggest that you do, I actually take big, huge poster paper and draw it out that way, right? And it's just a really interesting, it so informs so many things. And I hope that you're starting to see some patterns. Elaine and Lori, do we have time to put people back with their original partner?
No. We have about 20 minutes, Dory.
Perfect. Then we can spend about 5 minutes with our original partners, just kind of sharing our sociograms, or what you can either share your sociogram or the patterns that you're noticing. What are you seeing in your sociogram that you may want to speak out loud and have a co-conspirator work on you with?
Are we ready to make that move, Dory?
I think we're ready.
Okay, here we go.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Right. So I'm sure a lot of patterns came up for folks as they were looking. You may have seen some things that you need to work on, right? So you as an intentional cultivator of belonging, if you could put in the chat just a few things that you feel you need to work on, or you can speak it out loud. What are some things that you feel you need to work on with your sociogram and your connections? So I'm going to say this. The sociogram activity can sometimes have people leave their job, right? If you are looking at the terrain of your experience at a company and you have been there for a very long time and you do this sociogram and you find that you're connected to no one, yes, you could have tried to reach out to people, but you may find that, oh, you know what, this is one of those indicators for me that maybe it's time to consider another opportunity where I can feel more connected, where I can feel more vibrant about who I am and bringing who I am to work. So I think that's another consideration. Yeah. And someone just brought up this piece of how do you create the relationships when you're doing remote work? And that piece is really intentional, right? And in my pairing, we talked about the interwovenness of teams, right? And that the teams of people that work together, you can create a relationship beyond a manager that may manage you because the team has to get work done. And sometimes that happens. Yes, and we do. We have multiple sociograms that connect us in many other spaces around our workplace. Workplaces are pretty complex. So great noticing those patterns. And someone said, reach out to others more. And that's an important piece to say, I'm going to make an intentional effort to set up a monthly meeting or a monthly coffee with someone. Something that folks can do, right? We all have the power to do that, to connect with somebody who we don't necessarily connect with, to create our own communal sense of belonging between two people, between teams. We can do that. Elaine, could you go to the next slide, please? So I like to use this as an example of what WAJ was telling me. You know, he was really saying, how do we create a culture that doesn't suck? And we started right in the middle of this beautiful piece of work. And I'm going to say this is a beautiful tool. I use it quite often with schools and with organizations as they are wanting to look at themselves. And it's really, what are our values? And the heart are the center pieces to focus on first. What do we value? What do we believe in? And what's our purpose, right? And it always comes up that someone will say, oh, well, our purpose is our mission. It's like, might be, but maybe not. Maybe your purpose, maybe your mission is to build the best shoes and clothing possible, but your purpose is to have teams that work well, efficiently, and together, right? So that you can have a mission that is separate from purpose. So I share this, and it is the work, and I always like to make sure that I'm citing folks of Gustavo Rossetti. And on a sheet that I'm going to give you at the end, there's a lot about this particular culture design canvas and how to use it. I didn't encounter this probably until about 2 years ago. And I realized this is exactly what we were doing in our classroom for many years as we started to construct a culture each year with a different group of human beings. So if you are as fluid as educators, which I have a feeling many companies are these days with new people coming in, this has so many different uses. So Elaine, I think what I'm gonna do is go to the next slide. And I leave you these, and you'll get these slides. These are some questions for you to consider as you start to think about, how am I going to cultivate belonging? And the second one is incredibly important, I believe, this idea of candor. For me, in my experience of different spaces, this has been really, really vital. I have been in so many spaces where candor is not welcome, where any critique or anything said that is not positive is punished. And I think in particular, with our children, it is most important for me as an educator to cultivate their candor, to get their honest feedback, whether it be about a lesson, about a decision, about the way that we are interacting together. It is vital. And so I leave you that very important question because I think it is one of the things that can make a workplace a place where belonging can happen. It's integral. And the other two questions are really just questions to think about, some guiding questions for you to think about as you return to your workplaces and to share with others. So at that, Elaine, could you remove the slides and just have us look at each other, and we can do our Q&A. And I would love to hear what you all are thinking and hear feedback from you all. What's coming up?
Thank you